Good evening. So, I had an idea for a topic, and the idea has to do with experience and storytelling, and how the two kind of weave together. So, obviously, each of us is having a experience. We are a localized consciousness embodied in a material avatar, and we are having a lived experience. We are going through life. We experience pleasure, pain, we have fears and desires. And that leads us to pursue certain things and to avoid other things. So we have agency, we are actors, um, and we are also acted upon, right? Things happen to us. Um, Objects of experience enter into our field of awareness, our flow of conscious experience. And we either incorporate them or resist them, but they help to define our experience. Now, there's this deep need that humans seem to have to make sense of our experience. We want to come up with a story that explains our experience and makes sense of our experience, gives meaning to it. And of course, we use all the standard storytelling devices. We, of course, are the protagonist. We're always the good guy. The antagonist, the bad guy, that's always someone else. We're the heroes in our own story. And of course, every hero has to have some kind of character arc. That's part of the internal meaning of the story. That's what the story means for the protagonist. And in order for our experience to have meaning, we have to be able to tell some kind of story that gives our character some kind of arc, right? Rather than just random things happening to us, just doing random things. There's some kind of process of transformation that we have to go through. And it's like, now all of these things that happen make sense because these things help to forge our character and kind of help us overcome our tragic flaw or whatever. Or, this is what led us through this character arc. And then another element of it, of course, is the antagonist. Whether that's ourselves ultimately, or some other individual or group of individuals, or some force of nature, or whatever it is, there has to be some um, tension in the story, some conflict that we're having to face and overcome or resolve. And in most stories, that is related to the character arc. It could be kind of like two parallel things that are going on, right? The character has this character arc while he's also battling the antagonist or whatever, dealing with the conflict. But I think more often than not, maybe it's going through this character arc that allows the protagonist to finally confront and, overcome the antagonist or to resolve the conflict. And so I think that is also a part of our story that we create and tell ourselves to try to make sense of our experience and give meaning to it. We define ourselves in part through opposition. And that's why, on some level, we're always kind of looking for a fight. We're always kind of looking for conflict. We need something to push back against, something to resist, right? Whether that ends up being like the patriarchy or the tyrannical state or, terrorist or white supremacist or, um, uh, the central banks, the global power elite, or, whatever the case may be. And notice I don't say that that's wrong. Now, in my opinion, I think the best stories involve an antagonist where the antagonist is kind of like a mirror image or a shadow of the protagonist. Or his opposite, kind of a parallel opposite. And so, really, in defining our enemy, in defining our antagonist, we're kind of defining ourselves and creating our identity. If you are engaged in any kind of work on forming your identity, you will come across an antagonist. You will find a nemesis. As soon as you discover the self, the not self arises. But then also, that can and often does happen in reverse, where a lot of times it is the confrontation with the nemesis, the antagonist, or your opposite or whatever, that actually helps you to realize your identity. In some ways you could say maybe until Batman discovered the Joker, he didn't really know himself fully, for example. But I'm going to suggest that if you don't have an enemy or something that you oppose, that you can identify, that you feel yourself to be sort of struggling against in some way, then I would suggest that you're still a long way away from resolving your identity crisis or from finding meaning in your life. So, another way of looking at this is, of course, when we're talking about storytelling, we're obviously talking about something that's made up, imaginary. It's creative. It's a work of creative imagination. Now, there might be elements of truth in it, right? So it might be kind of comprised of half truths. It's based on something, probably. Because it's really hard to just come up with a story that's not based on anything, right? There might be, some type of various elements in it that are based on something true. Maybe the main character is inspired by someone you know. I think Sir Arthur Conan Doyle based Sherlock Holmes on some doctor that he knew who was really good at deduction and stuff like that. So by telling our story, we are essentially creating our own universe. Now, we're not creating it out of nothing. We're a kind of half maker, a kind of demiurge. That's what demiurgos means. It means the half maker, right? And of course, we say that, the demiurge created the world, right? He's the kind of Gnostic creator who kind of creates the world in ignorance as a kind of corruption of the pleroma, the world as it is, the world of truth, light. So I'm not suggesting that this is all the Gnostic myth is about. I'm saying this is one way of understanding what it's about in a psychological sense and who the demiurge really is. It's you. Or rather, it's the part of your psyche that is ego identified and is crafting a story that separates you, your essence, your soul, your spirit, from the pleroma, the world of light, the world of truth, the world of direct, immediate experience and perception of what is. And it pulls you into this world of illusion. Mm-hmm. This world of the storyteller. And the story you tell is usually a kind of protective mechanism in a way. It protects the ego. Sometimes just the story that most naturally arises out of your experience maybe doesn't fulfill the needs and desires of the ego, so it tells itself a story that's a little bit more satisfactory, right? Does more for the, egoic pride and so on. In the story you tell yourself about your experience, if you're honest, you'll probably notice that it all revolves around you, right? You are God, essentially. There is none higher than you. If you're familiar with Gnostic myth, that might sound familiar. That's the demiurge's problem. Now, the demiurge himself is a created being. Psychologically, we can understand that to mean that the ego is a creation. The ego itself is not your eternal, immortal soul and essence. It's a false self, which you've become identified with or kind of imprisoned by. Now, your true spiritual self is enslaved in a body, and, your soul energy, your spiritual energy, is used to animate this body in order to serve the demiurge, the ego. In much the way we see it in the creation myths of some of the Gnostic stories, where, spiritual Adam is kind of tricked into entering a corporeal body in order to basically serve the demiurge. Do you see it? So how do we escape? Now, there is value in the story itself. The demiurge serves a purpose. in the same sense that a dream serves a purpose. And I have talked about the demiurge quite a bit in the past as kind of the dreaming unconscious mind of God. It's the part of God that dreams the story, which is the universe or this reality that we inhabit. And I've suggested that the purpose of this existence, this reality, this universe, is similar in some ways to the purpose of dreams. In dreams, number one, the mind is going through a period of rest, rejuvenation. It goes through this cycle. In Hindu myths, Brahma goes through a similar kind of cycle where he opens and closes his eyes every however many billions of years or whatever, I guess. But through dreams, repressed content within the unconscious mind or the subconscious begins to manifest itself to consciousness. Consciousness as it is trapped within the dream. Of course, when you dream, you are conscious. You're not awake, but you are conscious. You are having a flow of mental experiences which are mentally generated by your unconscious mind, by the demiurge, so to speak. As within, so without, as below, so above, and all that. There's a parallel, there's an analogy that I'm pointing to. I'm not saying that this is the only or even the most important interpretation of the Gnostic mythos. I'm saying this is one dimension of it that I think is worth considering and enlightening. So we dream because we've fallen into a state of ignorance. The purpose of the dream ultimately is not to deceive us, but to enlighten us. I've heard it suggested that when we have nightmares, what's happening is there is repressed content that we're not quite ready to face consciously. So it presents itself to us in a distorted form. By analogy, I would say that the dreaming God, there are repressed aspects of his nature, being, whatever you want to call it, that need to be integrated in order for him to again become whole, one, fully conscious and awake. For whatever reason, there's some resistance, and so this repressed content appears in a distorted form. Now, some people mistakenly, I think, identify the shadow self with evil or your dark side. Dark, yes, in a sense, but dark only in the sense that it's not in the light, it's unconscious. It doesn't mean that your shadow self would go around killing and raping everybody. I don't think that's true. I think the true self, the self in its totality, is good. I think God is good. Within him, there is no evil. But the way the shadow might manifest itself in kind of a distorted form within a nightmare, we might call evil. So I'm not sure if that's clear or not, but what I'm suggesting is that evil is an illusion. It's a corruption, a distortion, a kind of exaggerated, caricatured misrepresentation or distortion of the shadow self. And it appears to us this way because we're afraid of it, And we're afraid of it ultimately because we're ignorant of it. We fear the unknown, right? And so I do think that the story has value. And I think that, we should engage with this story more consciously. And that can be a part of the waking up process. It can be one of the ways that we consciously try to integrate the repressed psychic content that's manifesting itself and revealing itself to us through these strange and sometimes bizarre dream symbols, or through the sometimes disturbing elements of the story. But there's also a more direct way to waking up, and that is kind of tuning out of the story altogether and trying to focus just on experience. Because whenever we have this story that we're telling or being told, that story kind of gets layered over our experience. And now instead of just experiencing directly, we're experiencing through this kind of filter, right? And everything is kind of colored and contextualized by this story, which is purely imaginary, right? And so we interpret our experiences incorrectly. And of course, we're in for all kinds of difficulties when our experience doesn't match up with the story, right? Um, I mean, let's say your story, you're convinced that the world is going to end in 2012. Well, it's 2021 now, right? So, I mean, if that was part of your story, this whole 2012 thing, Mayan calendar and like global cataclysm or whatever, um, your experience comes into conflict with that story, and either you're going to go insane or you're going to have to abandon that story and find another one. Usually, people tend to find another story to latch onto. It's too hard for them to just embrace their direct experience. Now, more recently, with this whole like Q thing, um, that was a pretty compelling story. It kind of pulled me in for a little while. I thought it was a nice story. I wanted to believe it. But, I couldn't help but notice at different points that it was kind of in conflict with my experience. And I'm pretty in tune with my experience. And I try not to let myself be blinded by stories too much. Of course, we all inevitably do. But that's one of the reasons I wasn't really all that affected by it. As I started to see things where it's like, okay, trust Sessions and all this, and now Trump's firing him. Oh, well, that was the plan all along, and then it's this, and then it's that, and of course now Biden's president. And there's some people that are still clinging to that story, and I still watch some of their videos and stuff, and it's kind of amusing because it's like, wow, they're really still trying to interpret everything that's happening in terms of this narrative, this story that they've embraced and made a part of their identity. And that's the thing, because the story does become a part of our identity. Um, what if the central conflict in the story turns out to be something imaginary, or the antagonist turns out not to be what we thought it was, or you know what I mean? That's why people cling to their stories so much. Whether that has to do with some kind of political ideology, some kind of religion, some kind of conspiracy theory, um, whatever it may be. Now, I mean, right now, this whole COVID thing is is a story, that's being told that, the public is kind of allowing to control their experience. So, I mean, some people choose to live their life by really engaging fully with the story. That's fine. If you engage with the story fully, um, I think that will probably help you to find yourself. I think that will probably lead you to find God or truth or your meaning in life and your true identity, your true self, your true will, and all of that. So I think that's legitimate. And then the other path of just dropping the storytelling and just paying attention to your immediate direct experience and sort of freeing yourself from the story is another way. And that's kind of walking along the razor's edge because as you go constantly, these dreams, these stories, these narratives are going to try to pull you back in. And they are very, very good at entangling you. That's one way of looking at this kind of idea that, after you die, which is to say, after you are ejected from a story that you're living, a particular life or incarnation, you go into some kind of realm where basically, the archons or whatever you want to call them are going to try to trick you into reincarnating into another story. Like, oh, you woke up from that story. Let me give you something else to believe in. Let me tell you another lie to get you to reincarnate. You see? Now, some people watching this might think that that is literally true in some kind of like spiritual sense or whatever. That's fine. I'm not saying that it is or it isn't. I'm just giving you a kind of psychological explanation that you can kind of observe and see that it rings true in terms of your immediate and direct experience, regardless of whether that's true in some kind of metaphysical sense as well or not. Most spiritual and Gnostic and esoteric kind of truths are true on multiple levels. And that's why we have this idea of as below, so above, as, you know, above, so below. So something can be true in a psychological sense as well as in a metaphysical sense. But that's one way of looking at the whole samsara, wheel of suffering, and this whole being kind of tricked to get pulled back into this wheel of reincarnation, death, and rebirth. It's just waking up from one story and it's like you get pulled into another one, another incarnation, right? So just wanted to share some of my thoughts on your experience and your story. Um, Hopefully, this has stimulated your thought on some of these topics. It's not intended to be a complete discussion or a complete outline. Um, it's kind of a stream of consciousness talk to, hopefully get your own, you know, mind going. So hopefully you've enjoyed it. Stay tuned, and I'll have some more stuff to publish soon, I'm sure. But thanks for listening. Peace.